Hello there, everybody, whoever everybody is. And hello, I think that's self-explanatory. I just wanted to say hello to all those that are there this morning and whoever watches at another time. Greetings too. Hope everybody's well. It is morning on the West Coast, 11 o'clock. On the East Coast, I would guess it would be 2 o'clock, therefore. I wanted to quickly say hello to the names I see here, quickly. Mr. StreamYard, copy and paste, toe cramp, Jack, Lee, old find dollar signs, old find finds dollars signs. The one, and Frank. That's who I see. And Lee, thank you. Greetings to everybody and whoever else, whenever they see this. So I was kind of motivated to do this. I watched a series last night, very late. It was the Bernie Madoff series. Now, doesn't that sound? Hi, M. Casey. Doesn't that sound like you'll get one good joke? Maybe. No guarantees. Hi, Jason. Arnolfo. I like that name. Arnolfo. I hope I'm pronouncing it correct. And Thomas. Hope everybody's great. So I was watching a series on Bernie Madoff last night. Hi, Darren. And I was motivated after thinking about it to talk about it a little bit because I think it relates to where we are today and certainly relates to some of the characters, at least in my view. This, of course, is all opinion, not legal advice, all that other nonsense. It's also not advice on what kind of borscht to eat, just so we're clear about that today. But I was kind of compelled to kind of talk about it a little bit and kind of just throw out some thoughts, and then you guys can decide, wow, does that make any sense or not? Probably not, but that's why it's not legal advice, of course. But just to kind of think about it, maybe take action if you think it's appropriate, and we can go from there. Of course, before we start, I just wanted to quickly bring to the table a couple of things. I placed this large world map in my kitchen and gave my wife a dart. And I said, wherever the dart, I see, the map's up in the kitchen. And I gave my wife a dart and I said, wherever the dart lands, that's where we're going to go for on vacation. So I just want to happily report that in September of this year, we will be having vacation behind our refrigerator. I noticed yesterday, this was yesterday or last night, per Reuters, that from 2007 through 2024, those are the years, they said 117. I don't know if that's an accurate number, but let's say it is for the purpose of discussion. They said 117 people died in gym accidents, accidents that occurred at a gym. And compared to that, only one person died from eating a chocolate donut, which teaches the ultimate lesson that choices do make a difference. Last but not least, because it's not last, it's actually close to being last, but I heard they're developing a new fragrance for introverts. It's called Leave Me the Pho Cologne. And last, and maybe least, I don't know if you've all noticed this, but erectile dysfunction stocks are on the rise. Thank you. So last night I was, again, I think it finished about 4 o'clock in the morning. And I was watching it late on a Friday night. So you can imagine how exciting a Friday night it was. But I was watching it. And the guy who played Bernie Madoff, I thought he was pretty good. But it gave me some pause. So the story of, if you don't know about Bernie Madoff, he's the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time. He had a company that he formed, I think, with a pretty small amount of money. Ironically, they traded mostly just on the OTC. That's where they made their money. I don't know where I've heard that before. Anyway, he set up a business. The irony of the business was it was kind of, or at least it developed this way, that he ran like one business out of one floor and another business out of another floor. and the two did not intersect. And he kept people, and it was like the 17th floor and the 19th floor. So I think the 19th floor was the legitimate business. The 17th floor was not, or something along those lines. And he kept people away, keep people on the 19th floor away from the people on the 17th floor. And his clients were, I think he first started in New York, and then he spread out to Florida, and then he spread out internationally. And apparently they had all these feeder funds. So in the United States, I think I heard there were like 80 funds that would invest. They would collect money, invest in there. And in Europe, there were like 200 funds. And these would represent, I think, the biggest and wealthiest families in Europe, and probably governments, etc. So he set this up, and the reason why they were interested in investing, because his returns were phenomenal. They were apparently, and again, I wasn't really following this at the time, but apparently his returns were the best on Wall Street. And so what happened, apparently, people would come to him, and he would often refuse their money to make them more interested in investing. And if anybody put up any stink, he would say, go, leave, whatever. He would encourage them to leave. That was kind of his game. And he was very charming in person and extremely controlling of the business. He watched everything like a hawk. To assist him in the business, his brother, he had a lot of family working in his business. So even they were actually working, but his family and friends of family. His brother was the chief compliance officer. You can imagine, based upon what you know, without me saying anything further about Bernie Madoff, that the chief compliance officer may not have done a terrific job. But anyway, his brother was a chief compliance officer, and his two sons, who were well educated, became head of the trading department. They were obviously younger. So what happened is they're getting these great returns. He's running like an advisory business, but it's not disclosed. And he apparently says he's operating with some strategy. I forgot the name of the strategy, but he's operating some strategy. So some firm in Boston is trying to repeat what he's doing. And they have some analyst who's a mathematician, and this is probably in the late 90s when this happens. And the timing is relevant because just think how long it took. So in the late 90s, he starts to get suspicious, mathematician analyst, because he's trying to reproduce the results. And he's trying to use the trading strategy that Madoff is using. And so he does it, but the numbers don't come out correct. So he's starting to get suspicious in the late 90s. And he tells his bosses that he can't produce those kind of results. It's not possible. So apparently that becomes more specific in 2000. So it's so specific that he sends a communication to the SEC. He says, I don't know how he's doing it. Either he's doing it a different way than he says it publicly, or else it's worse, kind of that. The SEC, I think, spends like 7 minutes on it, doesn't really do diddly. In 2001, he sends, I think, by the way, that was like an 8-page letter that he sends. So it wasn't like, check into Bernie. It was, somewhat detailed. In, I think, 2001, he sends, and by the way, this gentleman's name, the guy who's the heroic guy here, is Harry Markopolos, or close enough, Markopols. So he was in Boston. So he sent something in 2000 to the SEC's office. And one of the things he says, the alternative was either it's this or it's a Ponzi scheme. And again, the other thing that got his attention was it was performing perfectly. So there were very few months where they would actually have any losses. Mathematically, really impossible. 2001, he sends a complaint, complaining about, saying that he can't be doing this. The SEC looks at it and just basically dismisses it. They dismiss it because the people that are doing the analysis don't understand what they're doing. They're incompetent. That kind of comes out later, but that's the reason. So if you have somebody who doesn't understand somebody who's offering a brilliant strategy, that's not going to work. So 2003, a different hedge fund manager says, we have concerns about, inconsistencies in the numbers. In 2004, another group of investors come and complain. This is all complaints to the SEC, by the way, about Bernie Madoff. 2004, a bunch of private investors have a private investigator, and they say they're suspicious of what's going on. 2005, an anonymous informant lets the SEC say that if he's correct, he has suspicions that they are operating a sophisticated scheme on a massive scale and have been for a long time. This is 2005. So I've told you now, the guy, Harry, has suspicions in the late 90s, approaches them in 2000, 2001. Then somebody else approaches them in 2004, 2005. Then the same year in 2005, separately from that, Harry submits like this 30-page document, and in it, he lists various red flags. So he basically says, so the company says this, but that doesn't make any sense because of that. So it would be like us if we're talking about Reichman, for example. It would be like, if he had stock he gave away to his masseuse, for example, that might raise a red flag. So Harry raises 29 of these and submits it to the SEC, and basically says it's an impossibility that Madoff could have done that. And they continue to complain. Nothing happens. Nothing happens to Madoff. Zero. What happens is the 2008 crash, and as a result, everybody after the crash is trying to liquidate and generate cash. And during that time, he's getting all kinds of requests for cash. He doesn't have the cash. What apparently he did is he set up a bank account, just so we put all the players in here. He had a bank account at JP Morgan Chase. I think through the years he ran like something like $200 billion with a B through that bank account, and he always kept a balance of $3 to $6 billion in it. Now, this was money that what a Ponzi scheme means is you don't have enough money to pay all the investors. So if someone asks for their money, you take money from a new investor and you pay that to the old investor. And eventually, unfortunately, there will be a day of reckoning. If there's too much demand for money and you don't have enough, then you can't meet the demand. So after the crash in 2008, all these demands for cash come in. He tries to reach out to various sources because he had there was a bunch of feeder funds. There were people that kind of like were representing those funds who were his allies. I don't think they were involved, but they bought the whole scenario and they were greedy and accepted his return. But he reached out to all those people and he tried to get financed. And eventually there was so much demand and call for cash, he just basically threw in the towel and gave up, closed the doors. The feds came in and proceeded. Now, the parallel I wanted to draw was a couple of things. One, it was an absolute imbecilic, incompetent SEC who had been warned on multiple occasions of this scam and did nothing for like 10 years. And during that time, just to kind of give you an idea of the size of this scam, because remember, we've had inflation, a lot of inflation since then. So the amount of the loss, the total loss, was on the order of $70 billion with a B. And the amount of cash that was actually invested was somewhere on the order of $19 billion. That means that investors actually put up $19 billion, and this is like 30 years ago. So that's probably the equivalent today after inflation, 50, $75 billion, and probably a total loss of, 150, $200 billion. Huge amount. Biggest Ponzi scheme ever. So it was basically the financial crisis that caused the scheme to end. If there had not been a financial crisis, and if he didn't have the calls for cash, he could have kept this on probably till today, because the SEC was so incompetent, that they were not able to do the job. So the one parallel I wanted to make was the SEC. The SEC in this case had all kinds of information but did nothing. And it reminded me of Alpine, GTII, for example, MMTLP. I'll throw in the hopper also. So, with Alpine, they've obviously been involved in various actions involving Alpine. And even if by accident, despite what the DTCCC said about the concentrated short position that Alpine had in GTII, by accident, they would stumble upon GTII. And by accident, I don't know how they wouldn't know that when the OTC downlisted GTII to pink sheet status for questions about insider transactions, where were they? Where was the SEC? Why weren't they all over? I mean, I would think if there's a report from the OTC of potential insider trading that results in a company being downlisted, that I would think the SEC might be interested in that, because that's something they can control. No, this is all pre Paul Atkins. I'll get to post Paul Atkins when we get there. This is all pre. And there were more regulators. Theoretically, there were more regulators, but they did nothing. They did nothing. They didn't check it out. They didn't stop it from doing business. They didn't file any action that I'm aware of. Did nothing. And that was like a slam dunk. So by accident, they would stumble upon this. Now, if they happened to actually look into this specifically, there's no way they couldn't have been aware of the potential misconduct that was going on and did nothing. And then we go to, and I'm talking about GTII by accident. Alpine is a completely different story. Alpine they were on their own radar. They were initiating actions against Alpine. They knew that Alpine was a danger to the investment community. Why do I think that they believe that? Because they said that. So if that's the case, they did nothing. So we have Madoff going way back to the late 90s through the early 2000s, and after the crash, we are 15 years later, 15, and we have the setup I'm just referenced. Alpine still in business after everything that the SEC and FINRA accuses them. They are literally still in business, and the SEC, and I've repeated this 700,000 times, so let's make it 700,001. And still the SEC, as of today, that's including Paul Atkins, who I think is the biggest scumbag as the rest, by the way. It's given me no indication that he's going to zero. As of today, June 21st, 2025, 11:18 a.m., Paul Atkins has given me no indication that he has any interest in retail shareholders. Zero. And so until he proves me otherwise, I'm gonna not be very friendly to that particular agency unless they show me otherwise. And what's their most recent action? They dismissed their action against Kurt Kramer. If they had reason to bring the action in the first place, then why are they dismissing it without getting any type of relief? Now, if there's a good reason, Kurt Kramer, by the way, with a K, Kramer. If there's a reason, like if Kramer spilled his beans, or if Kramer has to appear on Seinfeld again, whatever the reason, that's fine. But if it was just because they're deciding they don't want to prosecute because they just don't want to prosecute, that's BS. And that's been my concern since the election is we want less regulation, but we want regulation that's competent and effective. and we want regulators that are competent and effective. We don't just want them to lay their arms down and say, you're on your own. And to this point in time, that's the way it looks. There's been nothing that I've seen out of that office since, since Atkins has been in place, before he's put in place, that gives me any reason to believe they're going to be any more stringent in analyzing what's going on as it affects retail traders. And the only option we have, option, pun intended, is to make it public, put pressure on them, reach out to them, write to them, embarrass them in public. You just got to do it. Can't tolerate it. There's no way of tolerating it. Just think of it this way. They have immunity. So there's limited impacts we can do legally, but from a public relations, social media, public point of view, we can make the point well done. Maybe even medium well, if so be it. And just think about it. This takes me back to Reichman. So, and back to Madoff. So this is the stuff that the SEC just kind of ignored, but kind of all the wreckage. Think of all the wreckage that the SEC permits to happen. So in the Madoff case, like I said, it was $70 billion or so. I think there were several suicides related to that. As a matter of fact, just think about this. And this made me think about Reichman. His two sons, I said, were in the company. Now, whether they were directly involved in the shenanigans or knew or should have known, I think it's probably likely that they knew something was up. But the crash is 2008. One of the sons committed suicide in 2010. The other one died of cancer in 2014. So Bernie left a lot of wreckage behind him. His brother ended up in prison. I think he's still in prison. His wife, I think, lost everything. I don't think she knew what was going on, but you kind of know. Yeah, I don't know. But my guess is if you're around somebody, they act a particular way, you sense that there's something going on, because somebody, if you're under that much pressure, if you're pulling a scam, you're on constant pressure. You're constantly shuffling. You're going to be shuffling constantly. People pick that up. So I don't believe that you don't know something's going on. You may not know specifically what's going on, but his sons are dead. He's dead. His brother's in prison. And he had no qualms about doing it. He just did it. It may have started innocently, often as Ponzi schemes, but once it got started, he, lived a very lavish lifestyle and just ripped everybody off. But the ramifications went beyond just the investors. It hit his family. And so that brought me to Reichman and GTI. That was the connection. So, if you believe the receiver's reports, all four of them, and all whatever evidence that he's relying upon and my own personal dealings, the management obviously acted with absolute intentional misconduct. And as opposed to Madoff, they didn't hide anything. Theirs was laid bare. So Madoff's case, they produced all kinds of fake records. But if ultimately went to get the tickets, the trading tickets, you couldn't get that stuff. But they actually had gone to the effort of hiding things. In the Reichman case, no hiding. I guess they just didn't figure anybody was going to look. But in a way, more blatant, so that if anybody would have spent, anybody who could have had access, real access, would have spent 5 minutes on GTII, they could have gotten to the bottom. With Madoff's, it took people that were of more sophisticated nature. Because just think about it. I probably should have added this to the SEC's incompetence. The SEC did at some point in time, early on, they send in a team, but they were like green investigators, intimidated by Madoff. They asked him for stuff. He agreed to produce it. They never looked at it. Zero. Didn't even look at it. And obviously it wasn't until much later when they sent in, teams, but that was already when he had admitted it was post the crash. There was nothing he could do because he couldn't raise the cash. He was stuck. And he elected, I guess, throw in the towel as opposed to contesting it at that point in time. But just think about GTI and Reichman. The way it looks to me, if you believe the receiver's reports, he engaged in all kinds of misconduct and may have impacted family members, including Justine Reichman, without thought, without consideration, without their, without, this is only my opinion, without their well-being at heart, just greed leading their actions, as opposed to not thinking about the risks that might be associated. So, I don't know why Madoff's son committed suicide. It's probably all the pressure, and you don't know what people might do under pressure. You also don't know what kind of illnesses that might be generated by all the pressure and impact on your immune system. I believe that, by the way. I believe like stress and extreme events can impact your immune system, and if it impacts your immune system, that can certainly impact your health. And I believe a lot of times when these people go through these events, it's their downfall of their health beyond everything else. And for Madoff's son, the one who died of cancer, would not surprise me if the cancer was exacerbated or worsened even by the stress of the moment. And the guy who committed suicide, I mean, it's got to be related to that. So that's the wreckage. So now Reichman is dangling around with his family members too and risking their well-being. And they did it in a much more blatant fashion. But again, SEC asleep at the wheel. Did nothing. Alpine still haven't taken over the business. GTII, we're kind of late for their participation. I'm sure at this point in time, hello SEC, I'm sure at this point in time, they, how could you ignore it? But they, obviously have never taken an active role, and they're probably waiting. My guess is they're waiting for all the, this is my prediction. We'll see how it plays out. My prediction is the SEC is waiting till all the civil stuff is over, and they will take all the civil stuff and all the evidence, and they will use it for whatever purpose they deems appropriate. I think the IRS will do the same thing. They'll just kind of wait till all this stuff is over, till parties take positions, because there's going to be, just think about it this way, in the litigation, because we talked about this before, that now litigation is going forward against Reichman and Griffin as to the shares. During litigation, there's going to be all kinds of declarations signed by Reichman or testimony offered under penalty of perjury, which is going to put him at a very difficult spot. Sometimes you might have to address one thing that supports your position on one end, but might be a problem on the other end. You may have to lie in some respect or in some angle. And if you don't, it might expose you to, certain liability. For example, just to kind of throw something out. Let's say you sold a bunch of shares. Let's say you misappropriated a bunch of shares. So is there a tax event there? So if you got a bunch of shares without consideration, is there a tax event? Arguable. Do you owe money for that tax event? If they find it's a taxable event, you do. And then, of course, if you sell that stock, that might be another taxable event. My guess is that they might have to say, like, we own this and did this. And unfortunately, they didn't do the other thing that they were required to do. So I believe that notwithstanding, whatever discovery shows, this is just setting, this is my opinion, this is just setting it up for the government to go after them. And, I think I mentioned this in Nevada, the law, and again, I'm not in Nevada, amongst other places, I'm not an attorney. I'm not an attorney in Nevada. Nevada, if you take the fifth, this is my understanding, if you take the fifth in a civil case, you can't defend yourself in that case. You can only argue, I think, about damages. So you lose. It kind of gets to the end, and then the issue is just damages. So I think that would be a great conclusion. So again, I'd be happy for Reichman to have to testify under penalty of perjury, because that's the way it appears to be going. If he does that, I think it exposes a lot of people potentially to all kinds of concerns And then again, the impact is, what are your concerns? You know, if I'm trying to think, and I don't know, because obviously I haven't been in that position, but if I undertook some act that exposed one of my kids to going to jail, I would think I know I would take the hit. I would take the entire hit and protect my kid. So it's interesting to see what tact Reichman is taking, where he's accused of all kinds of misconduct, and his kid seems to be the beneficiary of the fruit of that misconduct, as alleged, at least in the receiver's reports. And all my stuff here is obviously based upon all the evidence that the receiver has asserted in his 4 lengthy reports, including the last one, and the non-opposition. I don't think like there's any opposition, or hasn't been like any concrete opposition to anything other than that Reichman, for example, is contesting that he's not the legitimate owner of a certain amount of shares. So the SEC had a bunch of information in the Madoff case. By the way, I think the title of this live stream was Madoff-Reichman. I didn't think about it, but that's, basically sounds very much like a famous Nazi, a scumbag. And these guys obviously aren't equivalent to that, but Madoff-Reichman made me think of that after the fact. Disgusting SECs, because they are disgusting. They haven't done anything to assist. So I'm trying to think what else happened in that case that was relevant. I think what was interesting was what the Harry said. So he testified. So this is after everything, and he was pissed. He testifies in Congress, and because they're asking the SEC, they're trying to hold the SEC to the fire. Now, I don't know what Congress did to hold the SEC to the fire, because based upon the way they're dealing with Alpine, GTII, MMTLP, Mullen, I don't see anything different. I mean, I don't see anything different. So again, those congressional people who held some BS hearing, it resulted in nothing. But what Markarpolis, I'm going to call him again Harry, what he said was, I think, really important, and I think it's the problem as of today. And it'll special be the end. So he testified. He described the SEC as financially illiterate. Hard word to say. I can read it though. And largely held the belief that the SEC was suffering from systemic capture by the industry it was meant to regulate. Where else? I think Patrick Burns said the same thing. That I think even, was it Elon? I don't remember. Somebody else mentioned that too. But literally the systemic capture. He said that his documentation to the SEC proved mathematically that the returns were impossible, but they still got brushed off. And he attributed that, and one SEC official later confirmed that it was true, that they really didn't understand derivatives or option strategies that Harry had described to them. So they were just dumb. So he's basically given them the very detailed, knowledgeable view. They have no idea what he's talking about. Rather than finding someone who did, they just kind of blew him off. That's our regulators for us. The SEC, in evaluating, again, they haven't done anything, but in kind of looking back why this all happened, they said that somehow during these years, the SEC had developed kind of a adverse feelings to anybody who was a whistleblower. So if you complained internally, they looked at you as a scumbag, as opposed to a source of valuable information. And as a result, they were dismissive and disinterested. That was the internal policy back in 2000, as of 2010, 2011. As a result, they just didn't give a crap. And I don't think as of today that's changed. And I don't think it's changed with Mr. Atkins either, one iota. If he, could dump Kramer from Seinfeld, or just remember the most recent FINRA rule changes where basically they give, and I haven't heard any objection by the SEC where FINRA could just delay sanctions, reduce sanctions, delay the final result. I haven't heard anything from the SEC from that either. So Harry also says that a big problem was the revolving door. Where else have we heard this? This all arrives out of the Madoff thing 15 years ago. The revolving door between the SEC and Wall Street has further compromised regulations and enforcement. And there's been no change. I mean, as far as I know, there is no change, no restriction on interactions between regulators and Wall Street firms. And obviously, that shouldn't be the way. And I mean, to me, it's obvious. And obviously, there should be at least a time period where if you cease working at one, you can't work at the other. So, for example, if you're in the SEC, you can't go work at Goldman Sachs the next day. You can't do that. Maybe 5 years. I'll give you 5 years. So if you want to leave the SEC and then go and work in the financial markets at a hedge fund that requires interaction with the SEC, I'm sure there's other jobs where you don't have to interact with the SEC and have a conflict. But there should be a time where you can't move from one to the other, because that promotes the stuff that we know it promotes: corruption, favoritism, and much worse, I'm sure. Because we don't know, if somebody's going to pay somebody a bribe, are they going to write them a check? Or are they going to give them like a bag of money, or give them a Swiss account, or a bag of diamonds, or whatever, tickets to Australia? That's how it's done. It's not like somebody's going to write a check and then on the Ray line say bribe. Don't we all hope that? The only time, again, I saw anything like that, I think I've mentioned this before, has nothing to do with this kind of case, was in the Ford Pinto case, where Ford got sued because there were a bunch of fires after accidents involving the Pinto. And at some point in time, somebody from Ford threw into the document production some kind of internal memo which had some kind of calculation where Ford said, we have to move. It was the gas tank, the location of the gas tank. If we move the gas tank, it's going to cost us X dollars. If we don't move the gas tank, there'll be Y number of accidents and J number of deaths, and it'll cost us this amount. And they determined it would cost them less if they don't move the gas tanks than if they did. And this was put into discovery, and probably either somebody getting fed up with Ford, or somebody inadvertently doing it, and probably the last gig they ever had. And obviously it was devastating. So in 2011, there was a study done related to the issue of the revolving door. And it found out between 2006 and 2007, 219 former SEC officials filed 789 disclosure statements indicating their intent to represent clients before the SEC. So a bunch of SEC officials went straight to working in the private industry and then representing companies before the SEC. And how could you not be corrupted by that? Cannot exist. And again, this is what Harry, suggested was the problem back in 2010, but I think he had concerns about it even back in the late 90s. So, what can we do? You can obviously call your Congress people, you can call your senator, you can go sit and have a demonstrate. I've thought about this, by the way. How could you get attention? And, it's kind of like a severe remedy, but I think it would get you the attention. What happens? I'm not suggesting anybody do this, but this is kind of what I think about when I'm thinking about crazy things to do. What about if you had like a demonstration at the SEC and everybody went inside and you had a sit-in inside the SEC? You called the press, you did it, and you repeated it multiple times, maybe at different offices, and you called the press and you embarrassed the SEC. I know Ham did those trucks, but that's outside. I'm talking about literally going in the SEC and staging a sit-in. So, what's the risk in doing that? One, that you get arrested, which wouldn't be fun. But I would think, of everything that's been discussed, because I've heard everybody talk about that, they have discussions with representatives, they file legal actions, all that stuff could work, but it's so slow and lacks the dynamic interest. I bet you there's so many people, really, that if they were, not that they would do it, but just kind of if you were asked, if you could, wouldn't you like to sit in and protest in person at the government buildings and really state your opinion in that way? And I'm sure if I just asked people, if you could, would you like to do that? They would say yes. Now, obviously, as I said, all kinds of complications, but I've always thought, whatever. And of course, I was born in 1958, so I didn't really live the 60s, but I heard about it and experienced it some in the 70s. But those sit-ins really were effective. Doesn't have to be, of course, non-violent, but it really makes a point, and it's impossible not to be covered. Impossible. Now, it makes you also look like, to some people, might make you look like a lunatic too. That's part of it. But that's just an alternative strategy about getting attention. So that's one thing you could do. Of course, on an easier basis, you could send like letters to your congresspeople. You could send letters to Atkins asking him to get involved. What are you doing? You could bother Cook, all those things. And I'm going to send something to both Atkins and Cook. It might be some kind of combination. Seems. Yeah, I agree with you. And I'm just going to put this up quickly. Yeah, I don't think the regulators, I think they're full of it. I just don't think they do a competent job. And, according to Harry, they weren't competent. And on top of that, they don't do a competent job. So even if you kind of lay it out for them and you spoon feed them, they still don't get it. And then if they have no interest, like current, apparently, my opinion, current regulators they have less interest in examining what's going on. And unless you embarrass them and call it to their attention, I don't believe they're going to do diddly squat. Just my opinion. And sometimes embarrassment is the way it can move them forward, because otherwise you could be 100% right, but if you don't cause them to have any reason to react, then whatever. Why did he choose him? Because I think he's it's not like somebody's asking why the president chose Paul Atkins. I don't know if he had a prior relationship with Atkins. It's possible. It's not like Atkins is not deemed to be a competent person, but his interests don't lie in retail, obviously, because they've done nothing to this point in time to show that, including like the dismissal of the Kurt Kramer action yesterday or the day before yesterday. So why, I don't know. You could also point somebody and think they're going to do something, but they don't do like what you want. Like in the current time, Tulsi Gabbard, right? So the president I don't think is too happy with Tulsi Gabbard and has called her out directly. He appointed her, but things can change. And Paul Atkins is not a new guy; he's part of the old guard, not the new guard. And again, given no indication of acting otherwise. So until I see something, I don't get it. I don't think they have our interest at heart. That's the way I see it. So I'm going to write, but I'm going to contact him. I'm going to try to convince him or his counsel to really pay more attention. and they'll probably discard it, but I'll try it, and if we have enough people kind of banging on their doors, and if you know somebody in a higher place in government, reach out to them and have them bang on those doors too. That's kind of the way I see it at this point in time. But it was more like I saw the Bernie Madoff part, and I saw like the how it kind of things haven't changed at all, and I saw Madoff as being like a model for Reichman, and how the damage to everybody, including investors, but family, and the wreckage that Madoff left, I see happening again with Reichman. And I find that the SEC and the way they've regulated and the way they've supervised, like Alpine, GTI, MMTLP, is a disgrace, especially when they've had multiple times where it's been like put in their face. Congress put it in their face with regard to the Madoff hearings, and nothing has changed. Really, nothing of substance in my mind has changed. The misconduct exists, and then unfortunately for the ones that we see exist, they don't take any action against them, not real action. Anyway, so I was motivated by Madoff. Just wanted to throw it out there. It was kind of an interesting story with a lot of wreckage, and hopefully we can get the SEC to pay more attention so that there aren't more. We've experienced our own, but there could be like more of these, and certainly of larger magnitude. If one of the, obviously Madoff in the 2008 crash, we know what happened. It was terrible for a lot of people. We really don't want that again. So the SEC should at least be protecting us against those events, and we should let them know that and be loud in your dissent. And that's all I got to say about that. Anyway, to all you out there, have a great day. Be well. Take care. When I get some more info, I will let you know. And I do have another channel, Not the News. I think it's Not the News. I did a couple, but I haven't done a series of them yet. But I will. I'm going to talk about like the war and that kind of stuff. But I'll do it on a different channel. To anybody else out there, be well. Take care. Have a great weekend. And that's it. I think that's all I got to say.